2 weeks ago, I was interviewed in a vidcast about inspiration. We don't have to get into why I was the guy that was interviewed, but I was. And one of the questions I was asked was, did you ever consider a life of inspiration? Of taking a job that was inspirational. And one of the things I said was, oddly enough, and I was born in the late '60s, and I kind of grew up in the early '70s. And I had this park next to my house. I didn't have much. We didn't grow up with much. We were like 11 people in a 3-bedroom house, so it wasn't much. But I had this big 89-acre park next to me, and so I would walk around this park as a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old, and I would give motivational speeches as if I was talking to crowds. Well, you certainly know at that time there was not that industry. It didn't exist. And the question I was asked is, how did that come to be for you? Because that didn't really exist. And all I can think is, the well-known politicians and people like Martin Luther and John Kennedy and people like that, and then preachers and priests would be about it. So when I think about you and the folks that you've mentioned here tonight, kind of creating an industry of this, but also you are clearly just clearly grounded that this is more than an industry. There's a passion there for you, and there's a reality there for you, and an authenticity for you. But at that time, it's not like every company in the world is saying, "Let me go get an inspirational speaker." And certainly, nobody's saying, "Let me go find a coach or a mentor." How is it that you look at that time and say, "It made sense to me to keep this going and to make it into something"?
That's a really good question. I think we all need to dust off our childhood, and I was raised during radio only. There was no television, so I was born in 1933. So we only had radio, and no washing machine and no refrigerator. So we had an ice box and a scrub board and radio, and so I became audible. So I would lay by the radio and imagine. So not being able to see anything, I developed an ability to have instead of being someone who was visually able to remember everything I saw, I was able to remember most of what I ever heard. And I would listen to these fabulous, frightening, or exciting things, and they would go in my ears. And so I became a guy that had a phonographic memory. So phonographically, I could remember a lot of what I heard. So I heard President Roosevelt talk about yesterday, December 7th, a day that shall live in infamy. And I can recite now everything I've heard, probably mostly since I've been 6 or 7 years old. So we only had listening, movies, and books. So I read a book a week, and I still read a book a week now. So I think the idea of finding role models and mentors who could bring me out of my poverty mentality syndrome. I had boyhood PMS, poverty mentality syndrome. And in order for me to break out of my low self esteem, I had to find in an imagined way. And it happened to be the fact that since I could remember what I heard and I could talk about that, I became a junior high school this and the president of student body and governor of Boys State. And I began to give little talks in the neighborhood. And I gave 500 talks before anyone would pay me. There was no industry. So I was, even when I was a Navy jet pilot off a carrier, I was more of a poet than a pilot. And I knew that I was miscast, and I knew that I was defending the country in a war, and I knew that we were at war with North Korea, and I knew that I didn't want to kill people, that I wanted to do something nice instead of something dangerous. I wanted to help people rather than to hurt the enemy, but I was willing to do that. And what happened is my hobby, my passion as a little boy grew and grew. And I think it was my grandmother who said that I should model myself after people who were good in service. And we planted a victory garden and we talked about the seeds of greatness. We talked about the fact that weeds come in without watering. And I kept hearing these wonderful things coming from her. about why the Japanese wouldn't win the war because sowing and reaping, and I remembered what she taught me. And to make a long story short, I decided that in the evenings and weekends, instead of watching other people making money, having fun in their profession, that I would be doing something on the evening and weekend for me. So I would go out and give these little talks to anyone that would hear. And I finally developed POW, which, because I'd been working with prisoners of war, so I developed a brand which was POW, which at first meant prisoner of war, but I knew it was really Prince of Wales, power of women, putting on weight, prisoner of world. And it meant so many different things depending on your experience with life that I began to brand myself as somebody who was losing, who wanted to start winning. And I wrote The Psychology of Winning when I was at the worst point in my life later. So I was a late bloomer, and this career was just a hobby that kept on calling me and calling me. And it was a hobby until I was 36 years old. And so it took me until I was 36 to realize that I could actually use it as a source of employment because it was very difficult. And I had to back into that because the album had to hit before any big companies like General Electric or Microsoft or any would bring me in. So I was fortunate to have an audio album back me into the speaking industry, although no one knew that I had anything to say. And that same album uh, enabled me to be chairman of psychology for the United States Olympics. And then I was able to help Olympians and astronauts and prisoners of war. And so what I'm saying roundabout is that little boy passion is a career in the making. And so you want to dust off your childhood and you want to dust off what you love to do most in the evenings and weekends and what you would do. So if somebody said, if it weren't for time, money, or circumstance, what would you do? And of course, what I would do would be help other people by listening to them and then telling them what they needed to hear so they could achieve their dreams. But uh, I know it's a long answer and I should have made it shorter, but I stumbled into a career because it was an avocation, a passion in the evenings and weekends. I never knew you could make any money that way, and I thought I probably would be an airline pilot or an admiral. But other than that, I didn't see much opportunity for